a little store of capital, and to rise out of that trade in which he was educated. These are not ignoble aims, but his ambition would perhaps have been nobler and more fruitful of good to the world if he had stayed in his old trade and striven to create works of beauty which should live after he had gone. It must, however, be admitted that he would have great difficulties in doing this. The shortness of the time which we allow ourselves for changes in the arts of decoration is scarcely a greater evil than the width of the area of the world over which they are spread, for that causes a further distraction of the hasty and hurried efforts of the designer, by compelling him to be always watching the world movements of the supply of and demand for art products. This is a task for which the artisan, who works with his own hands, is not well fitted, and in consequence nowadays the ordinary artisan finds it best to follow and not to lead. Even the supreme skill of the lion's weaver shows itself now almost exclusively in an inherited power of delicate manipulation and fine perception of colour that enable him to carry out perfectly the ideas of professional designers. Increasing wealth is enabling people to buy things of all kinds to suit the fancy, but with a secondary regard to their powers of wearing, so that in all kinds of clothing and furniture it is every day more true that it is the pattern which sells the things. The influence of the late William Morris and others, combined with the lead which many English designers have derived from Oriental, and especially Persian and Indian masters of colour, is acknowledged by Frenchmen themselves to have attained the first rank for certain classes of English fabrics and decorative products. But in other directions France is supreme. Some English manufacturers who hold their own against the world would, it is said, be driven out of the market if they had to depend on English patterns. This is partly due to the fact that Paris, having the lead in fashions, as the result of an inherited quick and subtle taste in women's dress, a Parisian design is likely to be in harmony with the coming fashions, and to sell better than a design of equal intrinsic worth from elsewhere. Footnote. French designers find it best to live in Paris. If they stay for long out of contact with the central movements of fashion, they seem to fall behindhand. Most of them have been educated as artists, but have failed of their highest ambition. It is only in exceptional cases, as for instance for the Sèvres china, that those who have succeeded as artists find it worth their while to design. Englishmen can, however, hold their own in designing for Oriental markets, and there is evidence that the English are at least equal to the French in originality, though they are inferior in quickness in seeing how to group forms and colours so as to obtain an effective result. It is probable that the profession of the modern designer has not yet risen to the best position which it is capable of holding, for it has been to a disproportionate extent under the influence of one nation, and that nation is one whose works in the highest branches of art have seldom borne to be transplanted. They have indeed often been applauded and imitated at the time by other nations, but they have as yet seldom struck a keynote for the best work of later generations. End of footnote. Technical education, then, though it cannot add much directly to the supply of genius in art any more than it can in science or in business, can yet save much natural artistic genius from running to waste, and it is called on to do this all the more, because the training that was given by the older forms of handicraft can never be revived on a large scale. Footnote. The painters themselves have put on record in the portrait galleries the fact that in medieval times, and even later, their art attracted a larger share of the best intellect than it does now, when the ambition of youth is tempted by the excitement of modern business, when its zeal for imperishable achievements finds a field in the discoveries of modern science, and lastly, when a great deal of excellent talent is insensibly diverted from high aims by the ready pay to be got by hastily writing half-thoughts for periodical literature. End of footnote. Section 7. We may then conclude that the wisdom of expending public and private funds on education is not to be measured by its direct fruits alone. It will be profitable as a mere investment, to give the masses of the people much greater opportunities than they can generally avail themselves of. For by this means many who would have died unknown are enabled to get the start needed for bringing out their latent abilities, and the economic value of one great industrial genius is sufficient to cover the expenses of the education of a whole town. For one new idea, such as Bessemer's chief invention, adds as much to England's productive power as the labour of 100,000 men. Less direct, but not less in importance, is the aid given to production by medical discoveries such as those of Jenner or Pasteur, which increase our health and working power, and again by scientific work such as that of mathematics or biology, even though many generations may pass away before it bears visible fruit in greater material well-being. All that is spent during many years in opening the means of higher education to the masses would be well paid for if it called out one more Newton or Darwin, Shakespeare or Beethoven. There are few practical problems in which the economist has a more direct interest than those relating to the principles on which the expense of the education of children should be divided between the state and the parents. But we must now consider the conditions that determine the power and the will of the parents to bear their share of the expense, whatever it may be. Most parents are willing to do for their children what their own parents did for them, and perhaps even to go a little beyond it if they find themselves among neighbours who happen to have a rather higher standard. But to do more than this requires, in addition to the moral qualities of unselfishness and a warmth of affection that are perhaps not rare, a certain habit of mind which is as yet not very common. It requires the habit of distinctly realizing the future, of regarding a distant event as of nearly the same importance as if it were close at hand, discounting the future at low rate of interest. This habit is at once a chief product and a chief cause of civilization, and is seldom fully developed except among the middle and upper classes of the more cultivated nations. Section 8. Parents generally bring up their children to occupations in their own grade, and therefore the total supply of labour in any grade in any one generation is in a great measure determined by the numbers in that grade in the preceding generation, yet within the grade itself there is a greater mobility. If the advantages of any one occupation in it rise above the average, there is a quick influx of youth from other occupations within the grade. The vertical movement from one grade to another is seldom very rapid, or on a very large scale. But when the advantages of a grade have risen relatively to the difficulty of the work required of it, many small streams of labour, both youthful and adult, will begin to flow towards it, and though none of them may be very large, they will together have a sufficient volume to satisfy before long the increased demand for labour in that grade. We must defer to a later stage fuller discussion of the obstacles which the conditions of any place and time oppose to the free mobility of labour, and also of the inducements which they offer to anyone to change his occupation or to bring up his son to an occupation different from his own. But we have seen enough to conclude that, other things being equal, an increase in the earnings that are to be got by labour increases its rate of growth, or, in other words, a rise in its demand price increases the supply of it. If the state of knowledge, and of ethical, social, and domestic habits be given, then the vigour of the people as a whole, if not their numbers, and both the numbers and vigour of any trade in particular, may be said to have a supply price in this sense, that there is a certain level of the demand price which will keep them stationary, that a higher price would cause them to increase, and that a lower price would cause them to decrease. Thus economic causes play a part in governing the growth of population as a whole, as well as the supply of labour in any particular grade.